Hey there, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to BoldTV. Clay is out today, but we are lucky to have Alicia Neal, documentary filmmaker and friend of Bold, back again this morning.
Hello,
welcome,
Carrie. Thank you so much for having me.
you.
I'm excited to be here.
We're excited that you're here, too. We are going to have Senator Mike Lee from my home state of Utah joining us later in the show. We've also got David Frum, The Atlantic, and Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks Network. Make sure to add your comments and questions because we were going to be reading and responding to them live.
And now joining us at the top of the show today, we have Kelly Wright. We've been talking to him before the show. He's amazing. He is a journalist, a recording artist, author, and a former Fox News anchor. And Kelly's here today to talk about his new album, Love, Freedom, and Peace, and his upcoming debut performance at Feinstein's 54 Below. Welcome, Kelly Wright.
Good morning to you both. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you.
In great company, obviously.
You all got the memo on the blue hair.
Yeah, I know. We're
Okay.
vibing today for sure.
Okay, cool.
So we got a clip of you singing. Let's warm up our audience. Let's play that.
Okay.
Well, I pray to the Lord above to give us all just a little more love. Wash all the hate, sin out of our mind, and make this a better world.
I love
it.
the way the two of you are vibing
Oh
with
my
the song
God.
right there.
Those pipes. You got pipes.
Thank you.
We were sitting here talking, just kind of about life and love and freedom and what that means, but I genuinely had no idea that you sang like that.
Oh, thank you.
That was
I
really,
Yeah.
I got it from
felt
my mom.
Yeah.
She's the one who gave me that voice.
Oh, wow.
When did
God.
you start singing?
Oh, I've been singing since I was a little boy, but I actually started officially singing under my mother's tutelage in church. It was at the age of 13, started singing in my grandmother's church, my mother's church, a church that my family actually founded in my good old hometown of Hagerstown, Maryland. And I continued to sing. And when I was offered the opportunity to become a recording artist as a teenager, my mother stepped in and said, "No, that's not going to happen, young man. You're going to complete your education first."
That's what my mom would have said.
And she did that because she didn't want arrogance to settle in, which can sometimes happen when you're young and it comes to you so quickly. Easy come, easy go. So my mother, June Lorraine Overton Wright, stepped in and said, "No." But then after I started my career in journalism, I remember working as a TV anchor, and she looked at me and said, "Oh, maybe I should have let you record."
Aww.
How do you feel about that now when you look back on that decision?
I'm grateful for a single-parent mother who did everything she possibly could to help me grow up to become the man that I'm hopefully becoming, so that I can walk in God's footsteps and be a credit to her legacy, because she's no longer with me now, but she left me a legacy and not a liability. And I'm far from perfect. I fall short so many times, but June's mantra was always, get back up again. Get back up again, you can do it.
And you were in the U.S. Army also.
I was in the Army for 4 years. I was a young kid, fresh out of college, went into the military, served for 4 years. I look back on that experience during the time I was in the Army, said, "Help me."
How many lives have you lived, Kelly?
I don't know.
Military,
I'm still counting.
News anchor, now musician. What's
Yeah.
next? Firefighter.
Army.
I'm like waiting.
Minister too, and I don't do any pastoring, but I'm an ordained and licensed minister, but I don't really do much of that anymore because when I was working in the news business, I never really had time to fully devote to a church and giving my time to a congregation as I think you're required to do. So I speak. I do a lot of public speaking, do a lot of motivational speaking and inspirational speaking. And the same thing with my music. I find that music really settles people down. I often tell people that words often collide and divide. Music harmonizes and unites. There's a song, just like that song. Now, we may think politically different, but that song had you guys
We were all unified in that moment, right?
in that
Yeah,
song.
Like,
I
I
know.
felt
We're
it,
like
you felt
political
it.
opposites, but that song and the words.
Song
yeah.
unites. Love,
Yeah.
freedom, and peace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we hope our audience will make sure to check you out on iTunes, Kelly,
Yeah.
right? And I had no idea, as someone who goes on Fox and Fox Business, and you were a Fox anchor, I had no idea that you also had this hidden talent. So I'm so impressed and hat as if I was wearing a hat. I'd take it off right now. But
Thank you.
But we got to hark a little bit back now to some headlines of your,
Sure.
of your old Fox News days. We want to get your take on, for example, so Ivanka just had an interview and she said, no, I do not think that the press is the enemy of the people. And then you had the president saying, well, yes, Ivanka is correct. The press is not the enemy of the people. It's the fake news that is the enemy of the people. What's your read on that?
Well, my read on that is, one, that Ivanka is entitled to say what she wants to say. I think she's absolutely correct. I think the president, in making his own statement, is being as correct as he sees it, because he has he really has disdain for a lot of people in the media who speak out against him. I think taking it to the level of saying the fake news media is an enemy of the people is wrong on the surface. I think there's a better way to handle it. I think there's a way he can actually have a meeting with those so-called fake news people, and they can learn how to find some common ground, some common hope. I'm all about people coming together as opposed to tearing them apart.
So, well, and you had the publisher of the New York Times just had a meeting with the president, speaking of meeting. But then, on the other hand, you have them hiring an editorial writer who said incredibly racist, anti-white people thing. So isn't the New York Times at fault if that's the way they're going to behave and they're going to
And you've heard the
behavior?
New York Times defending their choice for bringing that particular person on staff as an editorial writer, and that was basically that they claimed that she was actually writing something in the same context as some people have written about Black Americans when they're operating professionally. I've been through that. I know what that's like, and maybe flipping it is what she was trying to do, but that becomes public record. And then you have to have the type of comport that you can actually come forward and defend what you said.
Well, and also some people pointed out that she made some of these tweets not in response to anyone. It wasn't a response. It was just her putting it out there.
Her putting it out there. You know, I don't know her personally. I can't get into her mind, but I think any tweet that denigrates another race or brings people down is a pox on all of us. And my whole thing is really love, freedom, and peace. And that's really what I want to convey to the country, because I think we're too divided politically. We're definitely divided racially. We're divided socio-economically, and we have to do better. We have to be, in other words, my point is we have to be our brother's keeper, not our brother's killer. And we can kill with words. You know, when you were talking about President Trump and Ivanka, that's a father and son, a father and daughter relationship. And the president's entitled to say what he says, and a lot of people in his base believe that he's being unfairly attacked and unfairly, attacked for all the wrong reasons, because he's built a great economy. We have more African Americans and more brown Americans operating and working jobs than ever before. You have to give him credit for that. And when you get into the political landscape, you've got the Democrats and Republicans, and it's midterm elections now. So the president is also using his base to say it's the media. The media's attacking us.
But is the concern not the authoritarian aspect of it? You know, the tendency that we've seen this throughout history, that, you know, one of the first things that leaders with an authoritarian bent, which Trump is one, I would say, they come out and they blame, you know, the media. And they say the media is not working, you know, for
But that's part
us,
of the
which is
age
what
of
he
populism.
consistently does.
When you're a populist, the populist, especially positive or popular populism, as they like to say, quote unquote. But I think populism speaks to the fear, and it speaks to the anger and the hostility that the base has. And there are a lot of people out there on left and right sides that are very angry and still very discontent because of the past election and because of just the mudslinging that goes on. It's a blood sport, politics. Even creating a law on Capitol Hill turns into a blood sport. And I think we are better, and we must achieve that improvement by getting down and talking to each other. You know, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, we have to get to a point that we build a beloved society. And that means we all have to find common ground and have a seat at the table of brotherhood. We can't do that if I'm pointing fingers at members of the media and saying, you're fake, and if they're pointing that finger right back at the president saying, well, you're fake, it becomes vitriolic, and it doesn't take us anywhere. I'm about lifting people up, not tearing them down. And that's why when I was at my old network, I was doing a series called Beyond the Dream, because everyone was attacking, you know, in this society, Black America, Hispanic, Latino America, and immigrants. And I said, well, wait a minute, there are a lot of exceptions to the rule out there. Let's talk about the ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things, people who happen to be of color. And they might be white, they might be black, they might be brown, but they're still doing extraordinary things to help not only build our nation, but build the entire world. And there's a lot of good people out there contributing to that scenario, saying, I'm going to do what I can do. I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I'm going to get involved rather than pointing fingers at it, knowing that fingers are also pointing back at me. I'm going to get out, get into the trenches, and help people live their best lives now.
Kelly, that's fantastic. Real quick, what's Brios TV?
Oh, Brio TV is a new streaming service. I'm the president of programming for that. So if you want to bring Bold to Brio TV, bring your money. We'll put you on.
I was going to say you should be the spokesperson for Bold with this bipartisan talk.
Yeah.
Always open. Well, I believe in bipartisanship, and I know you've got a show to do, but make sure you come see my show this Thursday at Feinstein's 54 Below, because we're going to entertain you and inspire you with love, freedom, and peace.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
What
Amazing.
a great way to end. Thank you so much for
You
being
ladies
with
are
us,
amazing.
Kelly Wright.
Stay amazing.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Let's bring a few comments. Amy Spears says, good morning, Bold TV. Good morning to you too, Amy, and happy
Hi,
Friday.
Amy.
Elena, or Elna. Hey, Elna. Elna Almond says, hello. And Daniel Tech says, what kind of channel is this? This is the first I've ever heard of them. Daniel, welcome to Bold TV. We are a bipartisan digital network, also bringing you the best in lifestyle and business. Welcome to Bold. And let's say welcome to our next guest. We're bringing in, for the first time, Miss Ann Brannigan. She's a staff writer at The Root, and Jack Crow. He's a news writer for National Review. We are going to be talking about, Elise?
So both of you recently wrote articles about Florida's Stand Your Ground law, and we've seen it hit the headlines, especially this week. And since the shooting of Trayvon Martin in 2012, people have been wondering about the limits of the law and where it applies and where it does not. And recently in Florida, as both of you wrote, a man was not arrested after he killed another man in a confrontation over a handicapped parking space. Now, and you wrote about this. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the situation?
Okay, so just to sum it up for people unfamiliar with the case, so this was a case of a black family. The woman, the girlfriend, Brittany Jacobs, had parked in a handicapped space as her boyfriend was at the convenience store picking up snacks. And then we have
This is an African-American man.
Yes, a black man. Then we have this white man, this 47-year-old white man, Michael Dredgka, who came up and started an argument about the handicapped parking space. There was a confrontation involved. We have surveillance footage showing not the confrontation, but an argument, at which point the man, Marquise McLaughlin, comes out, pushes down Michael Dredgka, and then stands back. And as he stands back, we see Michael Dredgka pull out a gun and shoot him directly in the chest. Marquise McLaughlin was taken to the hospital. He did not recover from his wounds. He died. And the sheriff in that county, Pinella County, opted not to arrest Michael Dredgka, invoking Stand Your Ground as the reason that he could not make that arrest.
Right, and Jack, what's interesting about this case is that it's uniting people on the left and the right, because you see the NRA.
Including the NRA, which
Sure.
I was very surprised by.
The NRA and Republicans who helped write this Stand Your Ground law, they said this is a misapplication of the law. Your perspective from the right, why are they stepping up right now?
Yeah, that's right. I think people in the NRA and the Republican lawmakers who wrote this bill recognize that you need to separate the question of whether you agree that stand your ground laws should exist from the question of whether the law is being properly interpreted in this case, which pretty much unanimously Republicans who wrote the law and the NRA are saying it's not being. So in the law, there's an objective standard that has to be met, which is that someone has to reasonably believe that they are in imminent danger of great bodily harm, or they need to be acting to prevent a forcible felony from being committed. And there's no way in my mind, that Michael Dredgka could have believed after being pushed onto the ground as his attacker was backing up that he was in imminent danger of great bodily harm or death. And the sheriff was basically saying this is a subjective law. It's all about how the person feels. If they feel that they may be in imminent danger, then they are in imminent danger.
Well, and the sheriff also is saying that his office could be held liable in civil court if he arrests a perpetrator who goes on to successfully assert stand your ground law. And so that's part of why he's being cautious about this. And what he also said is that, he points to two white people that he had previously arrested who then successfully went on to invoke stand your ground. And so he's being a little more cautious, he says, including the person in 2017. This apparently was a case reportedly of a woman who was being abused by her husband, and then she was arrested after he was killed. In self-defense, she was able to invoke the law, and now she's planning to sue the sheriff. So what about that, Anne?
I would say you have to consider that there's a blood cost here. When he's choosing not to arrest, because there's an investigation process that happens after the arrest occurs, right? So you're not even opening up that process. And what do you say to Brittany Jacobs? What do you say to the 5-year-old who Marquise McLaughlin collapsed in front of, who watched his father die? That because you're unwilling, because you're afraid that you might have to pay out of pocket, you are not willing to do the due diligence and arrest this man and just see it go through the process. That's incredible. And I think it's, from my perspective, I just can't fathom that. I can't fathom making that decision.
To what degree do you think there's a racial component in this? Because a lot of people say that this is inherently a racist law. Mm-hmm. And here we did see an African-American man that was being shot. And in the other case that Carrie mentioned, this was an African-American woman that was being abused by her husband. And at the time, the sheriff said that didn't apply.
I believe she was white?
She was
the woman?
I thought she was African American.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
That's you guys can check out. That's
Yes.
what I believe.
Oh, okay.
But can you talk about the racial implications of the law?
Of course. So, as you mentioned in your article, there's this idea that there's objective fear in a way. Like there's an objective perspective of what somebody would do when they're afraid. But something we have to consider as Americans is how racialized fear is in our society. There is a vast historical record of this. We have contemporary examples of this. We have study after study that shows the ways in which media reinforces this fear of Black people. It's pervasive, and particularly Black men. And so it's hard. You cannot disentangle this law from racialized fear. So what we have in this particular example is an example of gun violence unchecked, but also racial violence.
But I guess the response to that would be that very oftentimes this law is invoked by people of color who are in the fear of other people of color. Mm-hmm. You see statistically, and Jack, I'd love to get your thoughts on this because I've seen some conservatives writing about this, that stand your ground actually disproportionately protects people of color. And so therefore it is actually helpful for people of color.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that people of color live in higher crime and more violent neighborhoods, this law does come into play more for people of color just because of that fact. But I think the discussion we're having now really relates to the importance of maintaining the objective standard in this law. So if it is subjective, if the sheriff is right, and it's all about the subjective feeling of the person who's being attacked, then there's a lot more room for this kind of racial element to come into play, where someone might have an unjustified fear of Black people, and in that scenario, they act that out by using deadly force when it's unjustified. So I think that's why, if we're going to have these laws on the books, whether we should is a separate debate, but if we're going to have these laws on the books, there needs to be a standard. So does the person have a weapon? Are there arms around your throat? There needs to be basically a checklist of things that are going on where someone could say you reasonably feared that you were going to be killed. And if we don't have that, there's a lot more room for this law to be used by people who are racially prejudiced.
Well, and it seems like that seems to be the universal consensus. I mean, with the exception, obviously, of the sheriff and some of his supporters, but the sense is that this is not clear and that the law it really shouldn't be about your feelings, right? Isn't that what conservatives like to say, that facts don't care about your feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I think the law should be enforced irrespective of the feelings of the victim in the case. The scenario and the environment that the person in has to be paramount. There's no room for interpreting someone's mindset in a case like this and coming to the conclusion that this guy feared he was going to be killed as this man is backing away from him and he has a gun and this guy doesn't. That's just absurd.
I want to ask a question. Why do you both think that the NRA actually, stood against the sheriff's decision and said, actually, this is not an accurate application of the law?
I was personally a bit surprised by that, but if I were to guess, and I think you would have probably a better answer than I do, but if I were to guess, in an example like this where it just feels so cut and dry, it doesn't look good for them, right? It's in some ways the NRA.
So it's about the optics, you're saying?
Exactly. The NRA is very conscious about PR, especially in this climate when gun violence is at the forefront in a lot of the political debate now. So I don't think they have anything to gain, from defending such a cut and dry example of somebody clearly overreacting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think anytime you have a political advocacy organization on the left or right, optics are going to be first and foremost in their consideration, and the NRA is no exception. When a law like this is used in the case of a single mother killing an assailant and protecting her kids, the NRA sends that out over all their social media channels, and they want to say, look, this is a real-life example of this law helping people. When something like this happens, it undermines the intent and the spirit of the law, and I think opens up the possibility in people's mind that this is essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card for unhinged nutjobs to kill with impunity. I mean, there are people who know this guy and who frequented this convenience store who said he basically would go around this parking lot looking to fight with people. That's not who this law was designed to protect. It was designed to protect victims. This guy was clearly someone looking to pick a fight, and I hope the Justice Department intervenes here. There's a letter sent from Florida state lawmakers and signed by Kamala Harris and Cory Booker asking Attorney General Sessions to investigate the matter and potentially bring charges. And I think if justice is the motivation, he will do so, and there will be charges brought against this man.
Right. All right. Well, thank you to you both. I think I agree. Optics is for sure a factor, but I know folks who are very kind and compassionate gun owners, and it's beyond just that too. I think for many people in the NRA, and that's guiding the decision as well. But glad to have both perspectives here at the table. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have joining us via Skype is David Frum. He's the senior editor for The Atlantic and author of the book Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. You there? Welcome, David.
Hello to you both.
David, when the Iran deal was negotiated by the Obama administration, you called it, and I quote, a weak deal. Yet you've also been critical of President Trump's Iran policy of withdrawing from that deal. So considering that, what policies should the U.S. take toward Iran?
Well, let me explain very briefly why I was against it, very briefly why I think it to withdraw from it. Among the reasons that the deal was a bad deal was that Iran got all of its benefits, including a big release of cash. The United States would get its benefits over a long period of time. I think when you're negotiating a deal, they should be mutual. Iran's benefit should have been phased in over a long period of time, and its obligations were phased out over a long period of time. The problem we had once the deal went into effect was Iran and its benefit. The analogy I use is if you've already paid for the Costco membership, and you don't quit in January. You quit in December. You get your year out. But there's a special problem now, which is the Trump administration is obviously on the course of escalation. We have a broken executive branch. We don't have a proper national security system. We have a president who does not share important secrets with his own national security advisor, his own Secretary of State, and looks to be beholden to Russia in sinister and mysterious ways. The idea that under these circumstances, you would walk a path that could lead to conflict strikes me as a big mistake.
But in terms of the deal itself, wasn't the deal something that the Senate should have ratified anyway, that the Senate had to sign off on things? And so this is actually just Trump righting a wrong to correct the executive overreach?
treaty unless the Senate confirms it. You're absolutely right. It isn't binding, so the president had absolutely the power to scotch the deal. The fact that the president had the power to scotch the deal doesn't tell us whether it was a good idea. I mean, you had to reckon with this problem, which is the United States had distributed about $100 billion in cash to Iran. That was money that was frozen in Iranian funds, but nonetheless, that was a powerful lever. It gave all of that up in year one. The sanctions regime that had been built over the past decade was dismantled under the Obama administration. It's not going to be easy to put that sanctions regime back together, especially not for these guys who don't. I mean, the Trump administration acts as if the most important sanctions are those from the European Union and that from the bully. But Iran's biggest trading partners are China and India, and the Trump administration had no plan at all for reconstituting sanctions with China and India.
David, recently we saw, in spite of the war of words that we've seen Trump kind of invoke towards Iran and the president, we saw Trump recently this week said he's open to talking to Iran. What do you think about that?
Look, it's like asking a toddler what the toddler would like for lunch. It's very easy for the toddler to change his mind from pizza to chicken fingers. President Trump, as we've seen, when he's focused on his own survival, he's a very shrewd animal. But on these international negotiations, he's a child. He's gullible. He doesn't know what he wants to do. He doesn't know any of the facts. So look at what happened with the Korea. I mean, we moved from Trump threatening preemptive nuclear war against North Korea to gratefully thanking Kim Jong-un for returning bodies before they've done DNA testing to see whether those bodies that they have sent back, those collections of bones they've sent back, are even human bones at all, let alone American human bones.
But it's interesting because George Will criticized Ronald Reagan in the 80s and said he was too soft on the former Soviet Union. And I'm hearing echoes of that today. Isn't this something similar to what you're saying? I mean, because when I see Trump's behavior, it seems like he's really just doing a mixture of carrots and sticks, which is actually fairly common among other presidents.
Well, I mean, in the sense that he's putting the and sticks up his nose. Look, there were people who criticized Ronald Reagan. National security operation was a high conflict operation. That Reagan had a lot of very, very talented people who disagreed very strongly among themselves. And then Reagan was a pretty hands-off manager. So you would have these tremendous battles between George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, between Richard Burt, who was the ambassador to Germany, and Richard Pearl, who was the chief guy at the Department of Defense. Really smart people. And the president let this play out. And so a lot of the media commentary from the 80s, it wasn't really about Reagan at all. It was about people who were being pro-Weinberger and anti-Shultz, or the other way around, and taking part in those debates in the formation of American policy. And there's another question that, and this was where Reagan was really right, and many of his conservative critics were wrong. And that was, what was this man Gorbachev, who took power in 1985? Who was he? How much could he be trusted? How much of a good actor was he? The conservative media world, the conservative strategic world, was predisposed to be skeptical of Gorbachev. And Reagan, you learn things in Hollywood. Actors are very emotionally sensitive people. Reagan took the measure of Gorbachev and saw in him, this is someone I think I can trust. And Reagan was right about that. But Trump is no Reagan. He has no emotional intelligence at all. And Trump doesn't, and this is not the Reagan administration.
Wait, hold up. You just said actors are intensely emotional people. Trump is a member of the Screen Actors Guild, and he had a tremendously popular talk show. I would argue that he has a very robust sense of emotional intelligence, in the sense that he was able to galvanize and channel the emotion that a lot of people were feeling, frustration. If Trump has such great, but Trump has no ability to recruit talent. I mean, look at the people who work for him. The reason he's in so much legal trouble is because all of the people he hired to do his dirty work turned out to be idiots. Like Paul Manafort is in legal trouble because he didn't know how to convert a Word document into a PDF and thus got caught in one of his criminal schemes. Look at Michael Cohen, whom the Trump people correctly say is a liar and nearly a criminal, and that was Trump's closest confidant for years. And look at Trump. Look at who his first choice for national security advisor, a foreign agent. Look at his current national David,
security advisor, someone Trump.
that's why he won, is because he said that the establishment was so incompetent. You look what happened in Iraq. All the smart Ivy League experts, they got it so badly wrong.
Well, Trump was also one of the people who got it wrong because, of course, he was in favor of the war, despite what he said later. He was in favor at the beginning. He changed his mind later, as many people did. But when you say why did with Trump, there are always two questions about why he won. There's the question about why he won the Republican nomination, and then why he won the presidency. I think you're right about the Republican nomination. This is one of the big themes of Trumpocracy, is that Republican voters were signaling in 2015, we want more health care, less immigration, and no more Bushes. And the Republican establishment offered them, more immigration, less health care, and one more Bush. And so in the very specific context of the Republican nomination, Trump figured out something, or guessed, or stumbled into something about Republican voters that Jeb Bush and the others had missed.
Yeah.
As
okay,
to why
but David,
but that's not why he's president.
Could I have a question for him? So
He's president because the Russians helped him.
Well, okay. You said he's president because Russia has helped him?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a number of problems with what you just said, and I'm a liberal. But I'm going to ask because you're a pretty well-known never Trumper, right? How do you think that people like you can regain control of the Republican Party? Because even if you look at the polls, Donald Trump is incredibly popular within his base and within most Republicans.
Well, in the first place, I don't worry about that question too much because I think the problems we have right now are first and foremost for the structure of American leadership and world peace, which I think is really in danger. Secondly, for democratic institutions in the United States, the Republican Party will have to take its lumps. But what I also think then more deeply is when we get out the other side of the Trump era, our party system is not going to look like the party system of the recent past. We're going to go through an era, I think, in the United States, very much like what happened between 1968 and 1974, when the Democratic Party, which had been one kind of party dominated by labor and the white South before 1968, comes out of the process looking completely different after 1974. It becomes a party of minorities and urban professionals. And the Republican Party, as it exists under Donald Trump, that party cannot be competitive in democratic politics. So if it rests on too narrow a base, it depends on too much luck and voter suppression to win elections. So there are two paths ahead for the Republican Party, maybe more than two, but two obvious ones. The first is if it sticks with the path of Trump, the party has to become increasingly explicitly anti-democratic because not capital D Democratic, lowercase d Democratic. It can't win fairly. And it's not going to accept not winning. So it will look more and more to voter suppression. It will look more and more to foreign assistance.
All right. Well, David, we got to end it right there. Thank you so much for joining us. We're sorry. We would love to have you back. We heard you're out in the rural area. Your connection, it's cutting out a little bit. But that means we would love to have you back some other time.
We're having a hard time hearing you. I'm sorry, David.
Deep in the countryside. It's true.
Yeah.
Oh,
good. Well, that's good. You're helping Trump country understand things.
That.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Take care. So now let's move on to someone who, David Frum's a very interesting character. I hope we can bring him back with a better Skype connection or better yet in studio. But I want to bring in Ryan Clancy. He's the chief strategist at No Labels, which is a great bipartisan organization. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ryan, could you tell us a little bit about No Labels and the Speaker Project?
Sure. So No Labels started in 2010. Really simple idea, which was that our parties have no way to work with one another, and there had to be some way to bridge the divide. Mm-hmm. And so over time, the key focus we've had is in Congress, and we've helped inspire the creation of something called the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is 48 members, evenly divided between the parties. Think of it as conceptually like a freedom caucus for the political center. What we realized over the last couple of years is, most people wouldn't know this Problem Solvers Caucus actually managed to align 4 different times on pretty ambitious bipartisan bills on immigration, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on gun safety. Never even got so much as a hearing, let alone a vote. And when we started to dig into that, we realized that the problem was the rules of the House, the way it was structured. And so what the Speaker Project was the idea to use the election of the next speaker as leverage to force through some changes in the House in a way that opens up some possibilities for bipartisan ideas to get a hearing and become law.
Well, and we got a small video from your project about that. Let's play a listen for our viewers.
Congress is broken. It should be working to solve our country's most pressing problems. Instead, it's endlessly held hostage by party extremists. Why? One reason is the Speaker of the House, who is elected by a simple majority of House members. As long as the majority party votes as a single bloc, the opposing party loses any chance to affect the outcome. In short, while the Speaker is supposed to represent the entire House, he or she often functions simply as a majority leader, catering exclusively to the majority party's wishes. For the Speaker, this can be a double-edged sword. While they don't need to appeal to the minority party to keep their position, they also can't afford to lose support from their party's most extreme members. This makes it easy for strongly ideological factions to force the Speaker to focus on their demands and ignore the opposition party, even if the opposition holds 49% of the chamber's seats. These archaic House rules make the passage of bipartisan legislation virtually impossible. The time for change is now. We must push Congress to demand the next Speaker of the House change the rules and allow bipartisan bills to come to a vote. Learn more about the No Labels Speaker Project today.
So
That
it's
was
a very
great, by the way.
interesting-
That was
yeah.
very
I
engaging
love
and
those
very
animations.
accessible.
We try to make it simple because we understand that House rules on their own are a little, it's very inside baseball. People don't need to understand all the parliamentary stuff behind it. They just need to understand the big picture that it's the rules that are standing in the way of getting a lot of things done that people would like to see done.
So that little drawing, the first one, to me, it looked a little bit like Paul Ryan.
Yeah.
And if anyone knows me, they know I'm a big Paul Ryan fan.
Have you seen Carrie's
But-
Twitter? It used to be a picture of her and Paul Ryan.
At CPAC
And had I
together.
not gotten to know her well until I saw that, I was like, oh, God. But anyway.
Yeah.
But Paul Ryan, I think, is a reasonable person. I am so sad that he's leaving.
Right.
But he's certainly not someone I
makes
would
one of
describe
us.
as hot-headed.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you also have the line from former President Barack Obama that elections have consequences. So isn't Paul Ryan sort of the perfect speaker of someone who is not hot-headed, but he's also manifesting the will of the people because elections have consequences?
I think the fact that Paul Ryan is leaving is a good example of why these rule changes are so important. So if you look at the last two speakers, right? John Boehner left, right? Paul Ryan is leaving early. Now, most people at most points in history would look at the Speaker of the House as a pretty good job. So Paul Ryan is in his late 40s. He's got his whole career ahead of him. Why is he leaving? And part of it has to be at least that he's finding the job to be impossible. And when you look at some of these rules, so one of the ideas we talk about that needs to get fixed is there's this thing called the motion to vacate. And what that basically means is any single member of the House can file this motion to vacate, which is basically like a no confidence vote. And they can try to bring down a speaker. Now, that's really what precipitated Boehner leaving. Mark Meadows and the Freedom Caucus threatened this, and Boehner's position became untenable, and he had to leave. And so anytime a speaker makes any sort of nod to the other side, a really small number of members in their own party can basically say, we'll pull the rug out from under you and you won't be speaker anymore. If you made some rule changes, you could change that, and then suddenly the speaker wouldn't just be the speaker of one party. They'd be the speaker of the House, and they'd be accountable to all the members in it.
We have a viewer comment here from DE Rule. I don't know what DE stands for, but hey, DE. Says this all started with Newt Gingrich. His idea was that the minority party should not should have no say, and there was no need for compromise.
Yeah.
Did it start with Newt Gingrich? What's the history of it? Which means that that's fairly recent, if that's true.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. Is that if you go back and look at the way the House operated for most of its history, this is really an anomaly these last 20 years or so. Now, unfortunately, what happened is what Gingrich started. The Democrats took some of the same lessons, and they ran the House somewhat the same way under Pelosi. So this is a relatively new problem. What's exciting for us is that we think this can be fixed because when you look at this election, we don't know who's going to win, but we know that whoever does will probably do so with a very narrow majority. And that provides an opening for a pretty narrow group of members to hold out their vote and say, we will not vote for any speaker unless they vote for these kinds of rules reforms.
What kind of traction have you been getting? when it comes to actually when you present this idea to
Yeah.
members of Congress, to actually the people that could have the power to
Right.
change this, because generally everybody wants to preserve the power that they have in the status
Of
quo.
course.
So
Yeah.
at least based on my experience, there's always a resistance to change, especially when you're talking about systemic kind of procedural
Right.
issues.
So this is what's really exciting for us is we released the Speaker Project in June 21st. And a month later, the Problem Solvers Caucus came out with their own package. It's called Break the Gridlock, which echoes lots of the same goals, features a lot of the same ideas that are in the Speaker Project. And even more hopeful from our perspective is a couple of the members, including the co-chairs of the caucus, Tom Reed from New York, Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, they are already on the record saying they will not vote for any speaker unless they support this package. Now, if you could get a dozen, 15, depending on what the majority is, members to basically say the same thing, to say, you either support this package or you don't get our vote, then there will be no speaker. And, we did a lot of digging on this, and there really is a historical precedence for this. Back in the 20s, there was a group of progressive Republicans who didn't think they were really getting a seat at the table from the mainstream Republicans, and they demanded some rules changes. They didn't get them, and they actually held out for 9 ballots for the vote for speaker, and eventually
When was
leadership
this?
folded. 1923.
Wow. So
Yeah.
that was the last time.
Yeah, it's been about 100 years. So every 100 years, it's time to shake up the House a little bit, and so that's what we want to happen here.
But as far as bipartisan bills then coming to the floor, isn't that the other obstacle as far as like getting something passed? Because it's really a two-step thing.
Well, the thing is that there is a lot of legislation that if it ever did get to the floor, it actually would get 60% support. So if you, even today, so you look at some of the proposals on gun safety, around immigration, if it ever got to the House floor, some of the proposals the Problem Solvers Caucus put forth, it would get supported by every Democrat and actually a decent share of the Republicans. But it will never get to the floor under these current rules because the minority of the majority has all the power.
So you started in 2010,
Yeah.
right? So ever since then, I think many people would say, and potentially studies would
Yeah.
confirm, that the country has become increasingly even more polarized with every single election. Does this mean that, are you guys failing in your mission? Or
Yeah.
how do you see that?
So what we find really hopeful is there's no question that polarization is worse now than it was in 2010. But part of the problem that we found is that there is this huge mass of people out in the country, center right, center left, that they're really big numerically, but they've never been organized. And that's why the extremes in both parties tend to punch
So you're
well
saying
above
they're a
their weight.
silent majority, which is
There-
what Trump claimed his group was before he was
There
elected.
is a big group out there that is looking for the kind of stuff that we're selling. I'll give you a perfect example. Like any group, we track our online engagement. And if you look at any given week who's looking at our content, our peers are the NRA on the right and MoveOn.org on the left in terms of our engagement. So that's really promising. The other thing that's most consequential is this Problem Solvers Caucus. This is something that just didn't exist several years ago. So it's been a long road. We've been at this for a while. But what we have now that we didn't have 3 years ago, 5 years ago, is actually an organized bloc in Congress that is getting increasingly assertive. And we hope they'll be even more so in the next Congress.
Great. Well, we'll have to bring you back and give us the updates on it. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
joining us.
Appreciate it. And make sure to check out nolabels.org. We've got another guest via Skype. Hopefully our Skype is working. We've got Cenk Uygur with us. Cenk is the founder of the Young Turks Network and the host of the Young Turks. Welcome, Cenk. You there?
Yes, great to be with you guys.
Oh, look at your background. You look like the Obama painting.
I didn't even notice that. And the suit as well. It blends. Is that what you were going for today?
I wasn't going for anything. I'm just thrilled that I got Skype to work.
All right.
So, Cenk, you're the founder of your own media news company. Do you think that this is the future of news? Will we separate completely from paper and television? Is it going to be independent media?
Yes, so there's a lot of different answers to that. First of all, when you look at newspapers, other than a few major national newspapers like New York Times, Washington Post, etc., they're in a world of trouble. And it's based on the economics of it. They've lost the classifieds People in the old days, there was a morning, afternoon, and evening paper. That's because that's the only way you could get news back then. Now newspapers are an anachronism, and I wish it weren't the case, because I think print journalists do some of the best reporting there is in the country. And if we left it just to TV journalists, we'd be in a lot of trouble. Now, on the other hand, TV's got a lot of problems, and their audience is eroding. But digital media has its own issues, which is it is hard to monetize. So we live in a fascinating world where the media is in complete flux.
Well, Cenk, I certainly think in many ways you're a man ahead of your time. I did a podcast last year with your chief business officer, Steve O, talking about the woes and perils as the founder of Bold, and we're dealing with similar things. We're much earlier stage than you, so I feel your pain. And one thing that I think is very interesting, and we've had a couple people from your network on our show before, is that I would say that you're almost in some ways the guerrilla foot soldiers of populism on the left, But do you think, in some respects, that helped drive the wedge between the quote-unquote establishment, Hillary Clinton people, and Bernie? And do you think, in some ways, you might have exacerbated that?
I hope so.
Good answer. Good answer.
But then you helped Trump win.
No, not remotely.
Thank you.
I'll tell you who helped Trump win: Hillary Clinton. I don't know if people got the memo,
Woo,
but that's
preach! You are speaking my language, my friend. Let's just have you this whole time. Keep going. Music to my ears.
So I can't believe that we live in the upside-down world where people are still pretending that the candidate wasn't Hillary Clinton. Whose fault was it for losing to Donald Trump? Well, who was running against him? Of course it was Hillary Clinton. And and by the way, I want to be incredibly clear, and I get a lot of grief from the left for this, is when Bernie Sanders lost the primaries, I told people to vote for Hillary Clinton. Because whether it's a lesser of two evils or not, it's clearly still much better than Donald Trump. Are we still there?
Yeah,
we're here. We're listening.
Okay. All right. Sorry, mine froze up a little bit. So, look, Bernie Sanders was the better candidate, and it's not just because of my personal policy opinions. It was the polling. He was way ahead of her in comparison to Donald Trump and any other Republican. Okay, and so if we had gotten our way, right now we wouldn't have Donald Trump as president. But I gave it my best shot to make sure that he lost in the general election, and I think so did a lot of most overwhelming majority of progressives. Unfortunately, we had a candidate who did not drive people to the polls. She didn't get them excited. She said the status quo is great, the establishment is great, let's just keep going. And that was a terrible message that the country did not want to hear.
Well, but Cenk, I understand that you said they should vote for Hillary, but when I was there, where Elise and I met in Philadelphia in 2016, I saw a lot of Bernie Sanders stickers at what should have been Hillary's, nomination, and a lot of these people were very angry with her.
But you remember the timing of that,
this was the timing of the emails
dropped. that
right.
Pretty openly showed how the DNC was actively working against Bernie Sanders' campaign, when in reality it should have been a neutral observer according to the rules, and it never did that. So clearly there was a lot of justified anger in a way.
Yeah. Guys, two things. Number one, the DNC did cheat. It's now proven. And so I'm way past it. I was way past it in the general election. Yes, but I don't want Donald Trump to be president. But they did. And so now it's a proven fact. We were right all along. The entire finance of the DNC was controlled by Hillary Clinton's campaign. That's monumentally unfair. That's not even close. She was actually running the DNC behind the scenes. Now we know that. So why are we still having this conversation? Of course people had a right to be very angry about that. Now, having said that, conventions are not coronations of one person where we all have to bow our heads and pretend that they're perfect, right? So at normal political conventions, people come together who supported different candidates, and they still love those candidates. But at the end of the day, they get that there's a one candidate that's going to represent us, for better or for worse. And so it's okay to vent in the beginning of the convention, as they did. And in fact, the Clinton reaction should have been more open and receptive. Instead, they were closed and they were angry, and they shut out the Bernie Sanders people and wouldn't let Nina Turner speak, which, of course, as usual, made things much, much worse.
So, Cenk, for 2020, who would you put your money behind if you were advising the DNC and said, don't make the same mistake in 2020 as you did in 2016? Who would be your pick?
It's a no-brainer. Bernie Sanders.
Woo! Yes.
So, no, guy, look, you can say, hey, Cenk, your perspective is one that agrees more with Bernie Sanders' policy, so that's your bias. And that's fair, and that's true, okay? But when you're looking at it just objectively, for God's sake, can people please focus on the numbers and the polls? So Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the country. And Washington keeps saying, I won't believe my lying eyes. They almost sound like Donald Trump in their refusal to believe in facts. So the reality is there's a reason why he's popular, and there's a reason why Washington and New York can't understand it. They can't understand it because they don't feel the pain of the rest of the country. The rest of the country doesn't have health care. The rest of the country has terrible wages. The rest of the country is suffering. Washington and New York is incredibly rich, and they can't understand that. And that's why people like Bernie Sanders, because he says, I'm going to help you guys instead of the elites in Washington and New York.
Yeah,
and
no, I thought it was pretty tone deaf when I think she was over in India. Hillary Clinton recently said, oh, I won 2/3 of the GDP in the country, and that other third is the backwards. I'm just like, wow.
I mean, that
the
actually shows
antithesis.
exactly why she lost those kinds
She's
of
bragging
statements.
about how rich her voters are.
Yes, and Cenk, you guys were actually, TYT were one of the first media outlets to cover Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's run for Congress, and most of the media, was only after she won that the country knew who she was. And do you think the media ignores anti-establishment figures, and what role do you think independent media can play?
100%. That's a great question. So what a lot of people don't recognize about politics is part of because of the mythology that you hear on television. The mythology is that it's a debate of ideas, and whoever has the best ideas wins. The reality is whoever can reach the voters wins. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, that's the candidate with more money. In the progressive sphere, we found a way to break through on that, and we actually literally go to their doors and we call them and we reach the voters in an old-fashioned way, and it works. And that's why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won. Part of the way we do that, though, is you still need support from the media. What the establishment candidates have, and the guys who have with all the money, and the corporate candidates, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, what they have is they have the media on their side. And I'm sure that if you told the media that, they'd be shocked, and they'd say, "No, what do you mean? I'm not an elitist."
Well,
No,
and
but-
in fact, you can look at studies that look at political donations by journalists, and it went overwhelmingly for Hillary and not Bernie, obviously. But Cenk, look, I'm a conservative. You used to be one of us, and the reason that Trump won
Until you
is,
saw the light.
No, here's my
course.
question. The reason Trump won was because there were enough Bernie bros and sisters who swung over to Trump. So what would it take to get you back?
Yeah. No, look, Trump won because of 1,000 different things. I mean, he won by the slimmest of margins. He won because of the weather. He won because of the Russians. He won because of Comey. He won because of all those things. But the reality is that Bernie Sanders voters voted for Hillary Clinton in the general election more than Hillary Clinton voters voted for Barack Obama in 2008 in the general election. So I don't think that's fair. Now, what would it get me to swing over to Trump? Absolutely nothing. Nothing on this planet could get me to support that guy who is both a monster and a total and complete idiot. I would never support someone that with that low an IQ to be the most powerful man on earth.
But Cenk, what you just said about Trump, isn't by proxy you're insulting a lot of the Trump voters? Because when the voters hear you say that, they kind of think like, oh, Cenk thinks that I'm a moron.
Yes. Okay, so this is the trick that conservatives use. Hey, don't offend me, otherwise I won't vote for you. You weren't going to vote for Democrats anyway. Who are you kidding? And are you telling me Republicans don't offend liberals? My whole life, libtards, liberals are the worst. Liberals don't care. The liberals are stupid, et cetera, et cetera. No, I don't care about insulting Trump voters. I'm never going to vote 28% of Trump people in this country that support Trump, no matter what he does. Sorry.
No, but Cenk, but I'm talking about the crossovers, the people in that Venn diagram.
The ones that are potentially open
the more
coming
open people.
that are populist but fell for the fake populism and not the real one that Bernie was offering, is what she's saying.
What she's saying.
Ironically, the best thing that Hillary Clinton ever said is the one she gets the most criticism. She said half of Trump supporters are deplorables, and they are. She said the other half are just frustrated, and that's true. That half we can definitely get because we have real answers for them. The Trump answers are the Mexicans did it. Are you kidding me? The guy who crossed the border with no money in his pocket? How the hell did he get enough power to rig the system, right? Or the global conspiracy of the Rothschilds and the Qs and all that stuff. No! You know who did it? The people with power, the political donors who bribe politicians. They're the ones who rigged the system. And if you actually vote for the progressives, not corporate Democrats, but progressives, we actually want to help you and we want to increase your wages and we want to bring economic dignity back to this country.
Cenk, you are speaking my language. I could talk to you all day, but we have
Cenk,
to wrap up.
We can win you back. Somewhere deep inside.
Don't listen and carry. It's okay. You're good. You're good. In 2020, we'll get there, hopefully. But thank you so much for being with us, Cenk.
No problem. I just want to say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, by the way, will be on the Young Turks as a host tonight at 6 o'clock Eastern on tyt.com. So check that out. A whole hour of progressive talk with her and our other hosts. So thank you for having me on, guys.
Thanks,
Fantastic.
Cenk.
Thank you.
Well, and what's interesting, and I'm sure he'll ask her about this, is that Barack Obama did not endorse Alexandria. So yesterday he went through a big list, I believe it was 81 or 82 candidates, something like that, of people that he's endorsing for the midterms, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was not on that list.
But I mean, she doesn't need to be endorsed for the midterms because she already won her primary. So did he also endorse candidates that were going up against Republicans?
I mean, when they say endorse, I mean, you know how that is in politics.
Right.
It's, you know, I'm throwing my weight behind them.
Even if that were the case, Obama's a centrist. I'm not surprised at all. He's very much a neoliberal. I voted for the guy in 08. Anyway, he's the progressive wing. Obama has been pretty actively fighting, I think, since the primaries between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. So that's expected, I would say.
Did you vote for him in 12?
I voted for him in 12. I voted for him in 08. I voted for Hillary, but I'm looking to change the party, which is why I'm excited about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that's why I'm going to watch there when she hosts, and hopefully maybe we can get her on Bold.
Oh, yes, we are going to work on that. I would love to get her. I would love to get her debating a millennial
told me about
member
this,
of
that you
Congress
wanted to do this.
who's
Yes.
conservative. So she's probably going to win because it doesn't. There's not going to be a write-in challenge by Crowley. It doesn't look like. So it looks like she'll probably
be,
Ted Cruz to victory. Victory? Can I say that terrible pun? She's going to cruise to victory, and not the Ted Cruz guy.
Please do not put her on the same sentence as Ted Cruz. You're killing my soul, Carrie.
Yeah. So it was just
we actually saw we were at an event with her, and I was with you with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Cynthia Nixon, and she stole the show for me. And it's funny because I saw Tom Perez, who's the head of the DNC, talking about how she's the future of the Democratic Party. And Tom Perez was very much put in by the established wing of the DNC. Barack Obama even went behind the scenes to make sure that he was head of it rather than Keith Ellison, who represented the more progressive wing of the party. So to hear him say that somebody who is a self-professed democratic socialist as the future of the Democratic Party was a bit shocking for me, to be honest.
Well, I think when you're saying Tom Perez is the centrist, that's your problem right there. I mean, if the Democratic Party...
He represents the establishment wing of the Democratic Party,
I just don't
very
think
much
of Tom
so.
Perez as a centrist at all.
Yeah,
I think of him as quite divisive, sadly. I think that he plays a lot of the tribalism. He plays up the identity politics. He wants to make it all about racial divisions.
And I think
it's really
that's the
sad.
only reason why he embraced Alexandria, because she is espousing, I would say, an even more progressive platform than Bernie Sanders. And he was very much he did not endorse Bernie. He was very much a Hillary guy. But when the optics worked, right, when it was a Latina, young woman of color who professed the same policies, then it was acceptable.
Right. Well, that's the bias of the media.
Yeah.
So, well, we got a Skype ready. And I've been excited about this because this is Senator Mike Lee. He's joining us. He's a Republican senator from Utah, which is my home state. And he's the author of the book Written Out of History, The Forgotten Founders Who Fought Big Government. And this is for our Bookster segment. Welcome, Senator Mike Lee.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
And Senator, I'm a proud BYU graduate like yourself, and I proudly frequently did the Rex E. Lee Run, named after your father, who passed away from cancer.
Wow.
I'm so pleased to hear that you participated in the Rex Lee Run, as I have on countless occasions. My dad's been gone for 22 years, and we've missed him every day.
Yeah.
Senator Lee, written out of history highlights people that history books rarely recognize. So how did you go about conducting research on these unwritten heroes, and what was the most surprising thing for you during your research?
Well, I try to collect stories about people who have been forgotten, who nonetheless made a significant contribution to our nation's founding. We think of these founders as just the people who attended the Constitutional Convention, but there were more than that. And of course, those who attended the Constitutional Convention were exclusively white and male landowners, some of them slave owners. And that, of course, is historical fact. There's no point in debating that point. But the fact is that there were a lot of people who were neither white nor male and didn't own slaves. In some cases, they were women. In other cases, they were minorities. Well, one of my favorite characters in the book is Canacetego, an Iroquois Indian chief of the Canacetego tribe, who actually introduced the concept of federalism to Benjamin Franklin, who in turn introduced that concept to the other founders. And yet we've forgotten about Canacetego, in part because we've forgotten about federalism. And I tried to reintroduce Canacetego and federalism through the book.
Well, and Bobby Jindal had a very interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week. Maybe you saw it. He was saying that part of why our country is so polarized is the decline of federalism and the expanse of the federal government at the expense of what he says state government and civil society. And that's part of the divisiveness, is because the stakes are so high, because the stakes have been so coalesced at the federal level. Do you see some truth to that, what Bobby Jindal said?
Without question, I do. In fact, it's one of the points I make in the book. Look, when we put all of your eggs in one basket, when you put as much into government as our society has, and then you put almost all the power into the federal government, and all of that power into an unelected, unaccountable, bureaucratic branch of that government, you're going to end up with some real controversy. You're going to end up with some inflamed passions. And that's one of the many reasons why our Constitution was written the way it was, so that power was diffused, so that it was distributed, it was dispersed, and not all concentrated in the same group of people.
Speaking of what the founders would have wanted, I want to bring something up that made headlines this week about the bill that was introduced to ban 3D guns. And this was a bill that you blocked. And when liberals and conservatives, we often have this conversation about what the Second Amendment means and what the founders would have wanted and the kind of guns that were available then versus now. Do you really think that the founders had envisioned that one could produce a 3D gun and actually print it and make it themselves, so that there would be no way to track it and there would be no kind of regulation over that? And why did you block this bill?
No, there's no way that they could have contemplated it. There's no way that they did contemplate it. And whether or not they, in fact, subjectively contemplated that is utterly irrelevant. Look, any bill that begins with the words, "It shall be unlawful for any person to publish," is going to be problematic. The Founding Fathers, of course, didn't imagine the internet or many of the means by which we communicate, including radio, television, or Skype. Nonetheless, we understand that this is part of freedom of expression and freedom of the press, no less so than it would have been to speak in the town square a couple of hundred years ago. And so that's why I blocked this. Look, there are a lot of things that government might contemplate banning, but that it can't ban discussion of. And that was the problem with this particular bill. It was banning the publication of certain information, and I thought it was a mistake, certainly to pass it, and absolutely certainly to pass it by unanimous consent without ever having been through committee or debated or discussed.
Sorry, I just want to ask one follow-up question. Does government not ban the publication of certain information when it comes to preserving national security all the time? And could one not argue that this is an example of that?
Yeah, that's a narrow exception where you've got national security information that could lead to the death of Americans, of American intelligence agents, for example. That is a narrow carve-out that the Supreme Court has been willing to recognize, but that doesn't extend to everything. Look, there are all kinds of books available on Amazon.com right now and everywhere you can buy books that can tell you how to make bombs. Most kinds of bombs can be talked about and discussed openly and written about without any intrusion by government. Now, if you start printing classified documents that tell you how to make a nuclear bomb, that might be a different thing, subject to this narrow carve-out that I'm talking about.
But
But
Senator,
talking about instructions on how to build a gun, whether through a 3D printer or otherwise, that is not subject to one of the exceptions to the First Amendment.
But Senator, isn't there argument, and in fact, President Trump tweeted about this, and he said that this doesn't make much sense to allow the 3D printing to occur, and that he had spoken with the NRA about this. So it seems like the president disagrees with you.
I haven't discussed this with the president. I'm not sure what the president was talking about. And as to what the NRA was saying, I don't know or care what the NRA's opinion is on this. The NRA serves its purpose, but the NRA doesn't hold a seat in the United States Senate. I do. The NRA's purpose isn't to preserve the First Amendment. Mine is. And so whether you prohibit this kind of publication or some other type of protected communication, I'm going to object to it.
But Senator, why is this speech protected if it could then lead to violence? Isn't this the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded room, which we know is not protected speech?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I'm glad you raised that. Shouting fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire is not protected as speech, because it's going to lead to an imminent series of events that will culminate in violence, that will culminate in death. And the key there is that it's imminent. It cannot simply be that it could result in somebody going out and doing something with a firearm. Otherwise, we would ban all kinds of books, including books that talk about guns, including books that even talk about violence, including movies that include violence.
But Senator, isn't this a very different scenario? Because you're talking about explicit instructions on how to create something that you might not have access to. I mean,
and that kills people. I mean, a gun is a weapon to kill another human being.
Well, especially if someone
and there are all kinds of books that you can buy every single day. All kinds of books that tell you how to make guns. This is one of many different types of instruction manuals. We're talking about the instructions for building a 3D gun that could be used to make a gun. But if we're going to start banning everything that tells you how to make a gun, whether it's through a 3D printer or through a series of metalworking instruments, it is, in fact, the same thing. And it is, in fact, protected by the First Amendment. Now, it's important to remember that the gun itself, to the extent that it can evade metal detectors, is already banned and has been banned since 1988. The Undetectable Firearms Act, passed 30 years ago, already prohibits guns that can evade metal detection. Some types of guns that could be made with a 3D printer might include metal parts that are inserted in thereafter that might not, in fact, evade metal detection. But regardless of whether the thing itself is prohibited by law, it's the communication, it's the instructions themselves that are subject to First Amendment protection.
Well, and we see that the Washington Post just came out with a report this week showing that something in the neighborhood of 80% of children who get their hands on guns, they were guns that belonged to their parents or someone close to them in their family or friends, that these guns were obtained illegally. Do you think that these families should be held accountable? Should parents be prosecuted if they allow their children to get their hands on guns and commit crimes?
In many instances, they will be prosecuted, and the law allows for that.
In most instances,
but that's
they
not
have
a
not.
reason. It's not a reason to ban all communications about guns. If we're going to start banning that, then we're going to start banning all movies that include violent scenes. That we're going to start banning all books that talk about how to build a gun or how to use a gun. The fact that people might misuse that information does not entitle the government to ban the communication or the publication of that information.
How does this, I mean, Republicans often like to say that they're strong on defense and they're strong on national security and they're strong on, keeping people safe. And just this conversation, it makes me wonder how, and I get your philosophical objection to it.
This is not a philosophical
But how does
objection.
this, my question to you is do you genuinely believe that blocking this bill will make communities safer?
No. I push back hard on that, ma'am. I would ask you, what would this law have done to make us safer? The burden is on the person trying to pass the law, especially a law that is in rather flagrant violation of a constitutional protection, how would that law make us safer? Especially when the gun itself is already banned. It is a slippery slope indeed to start saying that we're going to ban the publication of information that could itself be used in a way to produce something illegally that could in turn later result in an act of violence. There are already more guns than there are people in this country. And we're not suddenly going to save the country simply by starting to ban publications on how to make a gun.
All right, Senator, you said that perhaps if the law was more narrow, what would it take for you to support such a law as this?
Well, if the law didn't begin with the words, "It shall be unlawful for any person to publish," then perhaps we wouldn't be talking about conduct prohibited by the First Amendment. Look, the underlying law that we're talking about, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, was reauthorized in 2013 unanimously by the United States Senate. That is the type of law that I and others wouldn't find any First Amendment objection to. And in fact, that was in fact reauthorized in 2013.
All right. Well, Senator, we went down that rabbit hole quite a bit on the Second Amendment question. But back to your book.
It wasn't a Second Amendment question. It was
I
a First
actually
Amendment
was
question.
really interested in the book, by the way, because I find it really interesting. And I think, all of these figures that you're talking about that we don't traditionally learn about in school, I think it's really valuable.
Well, and why do you think that is, Senator? Because, you mentioned in the
discuss.
book that there were almost 60 people who showed up at the Constitutional Convention, and yet most Americans can only name a few of those individuals, let alone all these many other people who had a hand in the founding. Why do you think that is today?
Well, I think we've found it all too convenient to, first of all, typecast those who influenced the founding, to typecast them as including only those who participated at the Constitutional Convention, and then to typecast them as only looking a certain way. And we forget about people like Canasatego, who I mentioned a minute ago, or like Mum Beck, the slave of African descent, who was held in slavery in colonial Massachusetts. And after the Massachusetts State Constitution was ratified in 1780, written by John Adams, she discovered that it contained language explaining that all humans are free and equal in a state of nature. And in the state of Massachusetts, they certainly were. And it occurred to her that if all humans are free and equal, then she shouldn't be owned by another person. Her master was Colonel John Ashley, and she went down the street of her own accord, sought out a lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick, who she had met at her master's home, and asked him to represent her in a civil action against her master. They used a technique known as the common law writ of replevin, seeking to return the possession of unlawfully possessed personal property. And she won her slavery, and she won her freedom from slavery. And by winning her freedom, she set us on a trajectory as a country where all other slaves would eventually be freed. Now, it would take many decades, and it would take a war to complete the process, and a constitutional amendment down the road. But she set it in motion, and she did this all on her own, just by recognizing that she was, under the law, entitled to freedom.
She's one of those hidden figures in history. She's amazing. And I think it's interesting because, we recently just celebrated July 4th, and I had, many of my friends, many of them African-American, and they said, this isn't a great day for our history because for us in this Constitution, we weren't even deemed a full person. So it's hard for some people to celebrate it. What would you say to them?
Well, what I would say to them is that our nation was conceived in liberty, and it was conceived with certain ideals. Tragically, those ideals weren't lived up to for many decades, and in fact for a century or so after we became a country. One could argue that it was nearly 2 centuries before their rights were fully respected in this country. Nonetheless, we were a freedom-loving country from the beginning, and the fact that our actions as a country didn't, in every corner of the country, always reflect that. It doesn't take away from the fact that what we did was bold, big, and noble when we broke away from the mother country, and we ultimately liberated those who had previously been captive.
It's a really
Well,
great way to end with. I like the use of your word bold in
'Cause
there when you
we're all about
described
bold.
the founding S.
Hey, it's a product endorsement for your show, right?
All right. Thank you so much, Senator, from my home state. That's right.
You know I love
You know, my
Utah.
grandpa probably knew your father. My grandpa was the Republican whip in the Utah legislature. So
What's his name?
his name was Ralph Sheffield. I never met him.
Wonderful.
So
Well, if my dad were still around, I'd ask him. I bet he did know.
yeah, probably. Great. Well, thanks so much, Senator, for joining us. We hope you'll come back soon.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us here today on Facebook and Periscope. Don't forget to like our page, BoldTV, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the same, BoldTV. If you liked today's episode, or if you had a lot of comments and just feelings that you want to talk about, keep going. Share it on your Facebook page. We love to have this dialogue, this bipartisan dialogue.
And
continue.
add comments as well. Those
Yep.
are always fun.
Yep. And thank you, Elise, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. Part of the family now.
That's right.
It's nice.
And make sure you stay tuned here for Bold Business at 12 p.m. Eastern and Bold Life at 2 p.m. Eastern. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye-bye.